The year was a crack in the dry earth, and for Lyra, grief was not an emotion but the very architecture of her house. Its foundation was the day her husband's heart had given out in the fields, and its walls were the fever that had stolen her daughter, Annalise, just 6 years later. Now, silence was the roof, and the dust motes dancing in the lonely shafts of sun were the only spirits that kept her company. She lived on the fringe of the town called Providence, a name so steeped in irony it had long ago curdled into a quiet joke for the desperate. Providence was a place of rigid order, of straight-backed pews and gazes that measured worth in bushels of wheat and displays of piety. Lyra had once been a part of it, but her sorrow had made her an outsider long before she stopped attending the Sunday gatherings. Her pain was too large, too unkempt for their neat and tidy world. It was a wilderness they preferred to keep at a distance. So she remained in her small, weathered cabin, a ghost in her own life, tending a garden that had yielded nothing but weeds since Annalise's small hands had last helped her plant the seeds. Time for Lyra was not a river but a stagnant pool, and she had forgotten what it felt like to want to swim. She was numb, a fortress of scar tissue built around an empty throne. She watched the seasons turn with the dispassionate gaze of a mountain, feeling the frost and the heat but registering neither as a call to life. Her heart, a frantic bird in a cage of bone, had long since fallen still. The town square of Providence was a stage for its particular brand of justice, which was often indistinguishable from cruelty. Warden Theron, a man whose spine was as unbending as his dogma, presided over these affairs with a self-righteous glint in his eyes. He saw himself not as a leader but as a crucible, burning away the impurities of his flock. On this day, the impurity was a young girl named Lyra. She was an outlander, one of the nomadic families who lived in the crags and were grudgingly permitted to trade on the market's periphery. Lyra was perhaps 12, with wide, terrified eyes and a frame that was softer and rounder than the hard-edged folk of Providence. This softness was her crime. The charge, read out by Theron in a voice that cut through the humid air, was wanton gluttony. She had been accused of taking a whole loaf of bread when her ration chit was for half. The baker, a man eager to curry favor with the warden, pointed a trembling finger, his face a mask of pinched virtue. Too fat for her station, he'd muttered, a sentiment that rippled through the crowd in murmurs of grim agreement. The sentence was 15 lashes. For a child. For a loaf of bread. The girl's family was not present, the outlanders were proud and kept to themselves, and they would not have known. Lyra stood alone, a small, trembling island in a sea of judgment. From the edge of the square, half hidden behind a grain merchant stall, Lyra watched. And for the first time in a decade, a crack appeared in the frozen pool of her soul. She saw not an outlander, not a thief, but the ghost of her own Annalise, small and afraid before a world that had no mercy. The sight did not just hurt, it was a physical agony, a lance of fire that pierced the thick hide of her grief. The executioner, a burly blacksmith who doubled as the town's enforcer, uncalled the leather whip. The sound it made slicing through the air was a serpent's hiss, a promise of pain. Lyra squeezed her eyes shut, her small body rigid with a terror that was absolute. The crowd leaned in, a collective entity hungry for the spectacle of order being restored. Warden Theron nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. It was in that sliver of a moment, between the nod and the fall of the lash, that Lyra moved. She did not think. She did not plan. A force older and more powerful than reason propelled her from the shadows and into the stark, unforgiving sunlight of the square. Her legs, unsteady from disuse, carried her forward until she stood between the blacksmith and the child. "Stop," she said. The word was a rusty key in a lock of silence, a raw, grating sound. All eyes turned to her. The ghost of Providence. Theron's face curdled from satisfaction into a sneer of disbelief. "Lyra. Step aside. This does not concern you." But Lyra looked at Lyra's tear-streaked face, at the way she flinched from the shadow of the whip, and she felt the fortress of her grief shatter into a million pieces. "She is a child," Lyra stated, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. She turned her back on Theron, knelt before Lyra, and gently pushed her aside. Then she stood, facing the blacksmith, and pulled the collar of her worn dress away from her shoulder. "I will take them," she declared, not to Theron, but to the sky, to the memory of her daughter, to the hollow space inside her that was now screaming with a resurrected fire. The debt is paid with flesh. Let it be mine. The blacksmith hesitated, his thick arms frozen in mid-air. He looked to Theron for guidance, his simple mind incapable of processing this disruption to the ritual. The warden's face was a thundercloud of fury. This was not justice, this was defiance. It was a challenge to his authority in the most public way imaginable. The law is for the transgressor, he boomed. This is madness. Lyra did not flinch. She simply waited, her thin back exposed, a silent testament to her resolve. The crowd murmured, their morbid curiosity shifting to stunned confusion. A woman who had been a spectre of sorrow for years was now offering herself to the town's most brutal punishment. It was a crack in their reality. Seeing no other way to reclaim control without looking weak, Theron gave a sharp, angry nod. So be it. Let her feel the price of disorder. The first lash was a line of pure fire, a searing agony that made her gasp. The pain was not a memory, it was a vibrant, screaming present. The second followed, then the third. With each strike, the numbness that had encased her heart for a decade was flayed away. Pain was the price of feeling again, and she paid it. She did not cry out. She bit her lip until it bled, focusing on the image of Lyra, safe behind her. By the 10th lash, her legs were trembling. By the 12th, darkness nibbled at the edges of her vision. At 15, she collapsed into the dust, her back a shredded canvas of raw flesh. The crowd was silent now, the spectacle having soured into something deeply unsettling. Lyra had not just taken a punishment, she had absorbed their collective cruelty and held it within her own broken body, shaming them all. She awoke in her own bed. The world swam into focus slowly, filtered through a haze of pain. Every breath was a negotiation with the fire on her back. For a moment, she thought she had dreamt it, but the throbbing torment was too real. A damp, cool cloth was on her forehead. Her dress had been cut away, and a poultice of herbs, smelling of pine and damp earth, had been spread across her wounds. She turned her head, wincing, and saw them. Standing in the single room of her cabin were 5 men, broad and silent as ancient stones. They were outlanders, their features carved by the wind and sun, their clothes the practical leather and wool of the mountains. They were Lyra's family. Fear, an old and unfamiliar visitor, flickered in her chest, but it was quickly extinguished by the look in their eyes. There was no menace there. There was something else, something heavier, awe, and a profound, solemn gravity. The tallest of them, a man with a weathered face and a braid of dark hair shot with grey, stepped forward. He knelt by her bedside, a gesture of such deference from a man so formidable that it stunned her. "We are her brothers," he said, his voice a low rumble like rocks shifting deep underground. "I am Cale," he gestured to the others. Bren, Torvin, Rorik, and Finn, they each gave a slow, deliberate nod. "We came to Providence when we heard what was done. We came for justice. Or for blood." His gaze was intense. "And we found that a debt had already been paid. A debt we can never truly repay." He bowed his head, a motion that seemed to cost him a great deal. "We beg for your mercy. My sister is safe because of you. Our lives are yours. Our strength is your shield. This we swear on the memory of our mother." Lyra stared at them, at these 5 immense men begging for mercy from a broken woman in a dusty cabin. The world had tilted on its axis. "I need no shield," she whispered, her throat raw. Cale looked up, his eyes clear and unwavering. "It is not a thing you need, but a thing we must give. It is our way. A soul for a soul. You shielded our blood. We are now your house, your wall, your hands." He did not wait for her permission. He and his brothers were creatures of action, not words. Bren, the quietest, returned with fresh water. Torvin, a giant with surprisingly gentle hands, checked the poultice on her back. Outside, she could hear the rhythmic sound of a hammer on wood. Rorik and Finn were repairing her rotted porch steps, their movements efficient and sure. They moved with a purpose that filled the empty spaces of her home. They asked for nothing, but their presence was a constant, solid thing. They brought her a broth made from strange, savory roots. They chopped a winter's worth of firewood and stacked it neatly against the cabin wall. They spoke little, but their shared silence was companionable, a stark contrast to the lonely silence she had known before. Lyra came one afternoon, her hand clutching Cale's. She stood shyly at the door before running to Ilara's bedside and placing a small, clumsily woven crown of wildflowers on her pillow. It was the first gift Lyra had received in a decade. She touched the petals, and for the first time since Annalise's death, she did not weep from sorrow, but from a strange, painful, and overwhelming surge of something that felt dangerously like hope. News of the 5 Outlander brothers living at the widow Ilara's cabin traveled through Providence faster than a summer storm. The town's initial shock at her sacrifice curdled into suspicion and then into open hostility. Pity was a blade they had been willing to wield, but this new Lyra, the one who took lashes for an outlander and now harbored 5 of their wild men, was an aberration they could not tolerate. She had transgressed a boundary far more sacred than the law against theft. She had blurred the line between us and them. Warden Theron seized upon the fear like a starving dog on a scrap of meat. From his pulpit, he spoke of contamination, of a sickness of the soul spreading from the edges of their righteous community. He painted Lyra not as a martyr, but as a traitor, her cabin a den of savagery threatening the moral fabric of their town. The whispers followed Lyra whenever she was forced to walk to the well. Women who once offered her sad smiles now clutched their children and hurried away. Men who had known her husband now stared at the ground as she passed, their faces grim masks of disapproval. Her home, once a symbol of her tragic isolation, was now seen as a fortress of defiance, an outpost of the wilderness they so feared. The community, that fickle beast, had turned on her completely. They saw the repaired porch, the neatly stacked firewood, the wisp of smoke from her chimney, not as signs of life returning, but as evidence of her alliance with the enemy. Lyra felt their judgment like a physical weight, but strangely, it did not crush her. The pain in her back was a constant reminder of what she had endured, and it had forged something hard and resilient in her spirit. The brothers seemed oblivious to the town's scorn, or perhaps they simply did not care. Their world was governed by a different set of laws, by codes of honor and debt that Providence could not comprehend. They continued their silent work, their presence transforming the derelict property. They helped her turn the soil in the dead garden, their strong backs doing in an afternoon what would have taken her a season. Cale found a small, struggling sapling on one of his forays into the woods and planted it in the center of the patch. For the girl who was, he said gruffly, meaning Annalise, whose story she had shared one evening in a quiet, halting voice. As her body healed, so did her spirit. She began to speak more, her words less hesitant. She learned the brothers' ways, how Finn could read the weather in the flight of a bird, how Bren could find healing herbs in the most barren-looking soil, how Torvin could carve a perfect whistle from a fallen branch. They were not the savages of Theron's sermons. They were men of deep dignity, their lives woven into the fabric of the natural world. One evening, as they shared a simple meal of roasted rabbit and wild greens, a comfortable silence settled over them. Lyra looked at their firelit faces, at Lyra sleeping soundly on a cot in the corner, and realized the immense, echoing silence of her grief had been filled. It was not gone, but it was no longer the only sound. It was now just one note in a complex, burgeoning symphony. This was not a replacement for the family she had lost. It was something new, something forged in pain and sacrifice, something wild and unexpected and fiercely, astonishingly real. For the first time, her house felt like a home. The confrontation, when it came, was inevitable. Warden Theron arrived at her gate, flanked by 2 of his brutish town guards. He did not bother with pleasantries. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes burning with the zeal of a man convinced of his own righteousness. The 5 brothers, who had been mending a section of fence, straightened up and stood behind Lyra, their presence a silent, formidable wall. "The town council has met," Theron announced, his voice carrying the weight of an edict. "You have brought a blight upon this community, Lyra. You harbor these people, in defiance of all decency and order." He gestured dismissively at Cale and his brothers. "You have one chance to cleanse yourself of this stain. Send them away. Return to the fold." Submit to a public reintegration, and you may yet keep your home. The offer was an insult wrapped in the guise of mercy. A reintegration was a ritual of public shaming, meant to break the spirit. Lyra looked from Theron's rigid face to the calm, steady gaze of Cale. She thought of the fear in Lyra's eyes and the fire of the whip on her back. She thought of the wildflower crown and the newly planted sapling. The choice was not a choice at all. She took a step forward, planting her feet firmly in the soil of her garden. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was as clear and solid as river stone. "This is my home," she said. "And these men are my family. They are more welcome here than you will ever be." Warden Theron's face flushed a deep, mottled red. "Then you are an outcast with them. The house, the land, it is forfeit. You will be driven out by sundown." Lyra simply shook her head. "You cannot take what is no longer yours to give." Theron made good on his threat. He called a town assembly that evening, gathering the whole of Providence in the square. The air was thick with tension and the smell of oil from the torches that cast long, dancing shadows. He intended to make an example of Lyra, to perform a public excision of her from the community's body. He stood on the raised platform where Lyra had been sentenced, and he began to speak, his voice a venomous torrent of words like purity, tradition, and danger. He painted a picture of a contagion, of a holy order threatened by a woman's weakness and an outsider's corruption. He worked the crowd into a state of fearful righteousness, their faces upturned and grim in the flickering light. He expected her to be dragged before him, weeping and broken. Instead, Lyra walked into the square on her own accord. She moved with a quiet dignity that stole the breath from his tirade. And behind her, at a respectful distance, walked the 5 brothers, their silent forms a powerful counterpoint to Theron's frantic rhetoric. They did not look threatening, they looked resolute. Lyra stopped in the center of the square, in the very spot where she had fallen. She let the silence stretch, letting the weight of every eye fall upon her. Then, she spoke. "You speak of order," she began, her voice carrying to every corner, strong and unwavering. "But I have seen your order. It is a child on her knees, waiting for a whip. It is a hungry man pointing a finger to save his own skin. Your order is the fear of a bully who mistakes cruelty for strength." A murmur went through the crowd. Theron's face was a mask of disbelief. "You speak of community," Lyra continued, her voice rising with a passion that had been dormant for a decade. "But what is this community? It is a group of people who would watch a child be beaten for a loaf of bread. It is a group of neighbors who turn their backs on a widow, not because she is wrong, but because she is different. That is not community. That is a pack, ruled by the loudest wolf." She raised her chin, her gaze locking with Theron's. "I chose to stand with honor. I chose to stand with courage. I chose to stand with a family that is bound not by the laws you write in your books, but by the laws written on the human heart. If that makes me an outcast in Providence, then I will wear that name as a badge of honor."